Hey, Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I am so looking forward to this conversation. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you for, accepting my invitation from the stranger saying, please come talk to me about this stuff. My community needs to hear more. But before we dive in, would you kind of share a little bit about your work and your special or your personal interest in the topic we're going to be exploring today, which is complex sleep challenges in neurodivergent kids?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm based in Christchurch in New Zealand. I work in my own private practice, and I've worked kind of specialized in treating sleep problems for almost 15 years now. Insomnia, circadian rhythm, sleep disorders, and sometimes helping out in a multidisciplinary team with people with other conditions like restless leg syndrome and sleep apnea and narcolepsy and really the full range of sleep disorders. And then I also work a lot with neurodivergent individuals, autism and ADHD a lot as well. And yeah, I just find these topics particularly fascinating. I've got my own history of sleep problems, and I've got neurodivergent children myself, and those areas overlap pretty frequently.
Yeah, it's great when your personal and professional lives intersect and you can kind of, I mean, that's what my life has been like for the past, 15 plus years too. So we've explored sleep challenges before on the show, specifically, things like kids with ADHD who have trouble turning off their brains at night, right? Or who struggle to fall asleep. And we've discussed sleep apnea and how that's kind of more common maybe in kids with ADHD than people may realize. But what we're going to be talking about today is completely new terrain for me. I was on a community call with some folks in my Differently Wired club who were sharing what they'd been experiencing and talking about some of the language you just used: circadian rhythm, sleep disorders, and then delayed sleep phase disorder. And I'm like, what is all of this stuff? And so I really set out to try to find someone to explore this with me on the show here, because as I started researching, I'm realizing, oh, this is a real challenge for a lot of people. And it seems like it's hard to get information. Like the parents who are negotiating this stuff are feeling pretty isolated in what they're going through.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a really topics we deal with every day, working in sleep. These terms like circadian rhythms and delayed sleep phase syndrome are not widely known, understood topics, I don't think.
Yeah.
And yet they're really common problems, especially for neurodivergent children. And
Yeah.
I think developing an understanding of the circadian rhythm especially can be so helpful for optimizing the sleep of our children, which is so often a problem. Yeah, it's certainly my own children. I'm thinking about that. They haven't developed pronounced sleep disorders, but partly I think that's because they're not quite old enough yet. They're not teenagers yet, but also because we've been thinking about that since they were quite young in order to prevent sleep problems developing. Just
Yeah.
knowing that there's quite a high risk of that.
So, all right, let me take a step back, because my hunch is that many listeners aren't familiar with this terminology. So, would you kind of lay the groundwork for us a little bit and maybe share what circadian rhythm sleep disorders are? And just, yeah, is there
Yeah.
a definition for it? And maybe talk about some of the different ways it can present.
Yeah, absolutely. So the circadian rhythm is essentially our body clock. It's our underlying physiological mechanism that essentially determines when we're able to sleep and when we're likely to be awake. When it's functioning well, it's nicely kind of aligned with the cycle of day and night, and it promotes wakefulness during the day and it promotes sleepiness during the night. And I guess most of us are probably familiar with it being out of alignment when we travel overseas. And if you fly to the other side of the world, you'll experience immediate misalignment. and you'll want to be asleep during the day, and you'll want to be awake at night, and you've suddenly acquired a circadian rhythm problem. It's known as jet lag. And for most people, jet lag's a fairly brief problem that naturally goes away over a few days. But for a lot of people living in the modern world, especially, they can develop chronic circadian rhythm disorders, and the most common of those is something called delayed sleep phase syndrome, and that's where people's internal body clock is chronically delayed relative to the local time zone. And so it's a little bit like their internal body clock thinks they're maybe 3 or 4 or 5 time zones further around the world than they really are. When it's delayed sleep phase syndrome, that's in a westerly direction around the world from where they actually are. Occasionally people have something called advanced sleep phase syndrome, which is where their body clock runs earlier than the local time zone, and it's a little bit like they're somewhere to the east of where they actually are in the world. That's sort of a bit more common in older folk who wake up too early and go to bed very early.
Okay, already I've got questions. So, okay, so delayed sleep phase disorder is basically like, would you think that someone who's a night owl, who's up till 3 a.m. and then they sleep until like 3 p.m. or whatever, would that be an example? And is it something that is consistent? It's just that their entire clock is on I guess a different rhythm.
Yeah, exactly. So the typical person with delayed sleep phase syndrome is up until 1 or 2 or 3 a.m. and then they're not waking until the late morning or after. And some people with delayed sleep phase syndrome are literally staying up and doing activities until well after midnight. Mm-hmm. Whereas some people actually will go to bed at a normal time, go to bed at 10 or 11 p.m., but they just can't sleep, and they'll actually lie awake in bed for hours, just staring at the ceiling, or just tossing and turning in the state of really just being alert and being in this fully awake state, nowhere near sleep, which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
Just unpleasant state that goes on and on and on and on for hours, and they typically think they have insomnia when really they have a circadian misalignment. Yeah, no amount of relaxation will let them sleep, because it's not actually the anxiety that's keeping them awake. They may be anxious, or they may be completely relaxed, but they won't fall asleep because their body clock has not prepared their body and their brain to fall asleep, and won't do so for several hours. That's the typical case, and that's what we see in a lot of teenagers and a lot of people in their early 20s. It's very, very common, but we also see it in adults past the 20s as well. Yeah, and particularly in folk with ADHD, it's really common for ADHD folk to have it well into their middle adulthood. And of course, for children with ADHD, they're more likely to have it from earlier teenage years as well.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to, full disclosure, I'm already connecting dots in my own home right now that I was not anticipating. So I'm going to set that to the side. Okay. I'm going to stay in my interviewer role here, but I'm definitely already starting to realize that this is hitting closer to home than I thought. Okay. There's one other sleep disorder that I want to also just get kind of a general definition of before we dive any further. And that's something called non-24. Am I saying that right? Non-24 sleep disorder?
Yeah, it's really when the circadian rhythm is not following a regular schedule. So most people with delayed sleep phase syndrome, their body clock is delayed, but it's reasonably consistent. So they'll fall asleep typically between 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. and it's a similar time each night, and it doesn't change too much over time. Whereas some people have a very varied circadian rhythm, and it's sort of all over the place. And some nights they'll fall asleep at 2 a.m., some nights they'll fall asleep at 6 a.m., some nights they'll fall asleep at 11 a.m., and they'll sleep through until 7 p.m. And so if you like drew a chart of their sleep over the 24-hour cycle, it would look like there was no real pattern to when they were awake and when they were asleep. It would sort of look like a newborn baby almost. In reality, there's almost always is a circadian rhythm, and it's just following maybe a 26-hour pattern, because our body clock, our circadian rhythm can actually stretch, and actually it naturally kind of it wants to stretch, and even for the average person, it would naturally follow maybe a 24.5-hour cycle if we weren't exposed to the factors that entrain it into a 24-hour cycle each day. So it's exposure to bright light in the morning and during the early part of the day that kind of locks our body clock into the 24-hour cycle. It's exposure to sunlight. And if we were to be in an environment where there was no exposure to that cycle of light, there's been research, for example, with people living in caves with no clocks, and who are freely left to just choose when they want to stay up and when they want to go to bed, and also people living in laboratories with no windows, no clocks, and no external cues of what the time is. Yeah, their body clocks follow roughly 24.5 hours. So everybody's body clock is slightly non-24 hour, but some people, they seem to have even longer natural circadian period. It might be 26 hours, and they will just get more and more out of sync each day. And the fact that we spend a lot of time indoors means we don't, and a lot of us don't get exposure to natural light a lot during a typical day. If we're inside at home and our time off, and we're in maybe an office building or a school or a university rooms during the day, and then at night time we've got exposure to electric lighting and screens, and that pattern of exposure to light is so unnatural that it just confuses our circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
And so for sensitive individuals, that can lead to this non-24-hour pattern. Okay. I think one thing to keep in mind is that some folk are very sensitive, and some people are kind of have this sort of robust biological clock that can put up with a lot of confusing stimuli, and they still can sleep quite well. And it's really a genetic thing. And so it seems that our neurodivergent children and adults are sensitive. They're genetically sensitive to circadian disturbance, and they kind of need a more natural circadian environment in order to sleep well. Generally, they need more light exposure during the morning and less light exposure at night, generally, to have a good functioning circadian rhythm.
You mentioned that neurodivergent people, or some people, might be more genetically predisposed to having these types of sleep challenges. And I'd love if you could unpack that a little bit, specifically related to neurodivergence and what we know about that. Is it about melatonin? Is it about the sensitivities? Is it a combination of factors?
Yeah, well, I think one of the factors that has been discovered is about variation in the sensitivity to light, and how responsive individuals' circadian system is to different levels of light. So people with this delayed sleep phase tendency, and this is more common in neurodivergent folk, are more sensitive to the delaying effects of evening light exposure than people whose body clocks are more early, so the sort of the night owls. So the same amount of light in the evening will delay their sleep by a greater degree. And the threshold of brightness of light that might have a delaying effect, and it has that effect partially through suppressing the amount of melatonin that their brains will naturally produce in the evening, is the threshold for that suppression effect is lower. And so a dim light can have a detrimental effect, or a relatively dim light might be enough to have a detrimental effect. Whereas morning larks, or people who naturally go to bed early, go to sleep early, wake up early, they can tolerate light at night time quite well, and it doesn't seem to delay their sleep. And I'm a bit like that. I can sort of put up with light, and it doesn't seem to delay my sleep. And then the opposite is true in the morning. So in the morning, delayed sleep phase syndrome people are less sensitive to light, and so they need more light in the morning to get the beneficial effect of light in promoting early waking and promoting earlier onset of sleep and greater ease of falling asleep. And so the sort of light levels you might get in a typical home, even in a well-lit home, even a home with lots of windows, is not enough. And they really, to get the benefit, would need to go outside and get exposure to daylight. Or for some people, using light boxes or light visors, which you can get now, which have LED lights built into a frame, and you just wear them like a pair of glasses, and they've got just little blue or blue-green LEDs. Yeah, so the genetic difference, one of the mechanisms at least, is that reduced sensitivity to light in the morning, and therefore greater need for more bright light. And so it's a bit of a burden almost. But if you recognise that and you factor that in, you can really prevent your body clock delaying, or slowly bring your body clock earlier by regularly dimming the light in those hours before bed. But actually, more importantly, getting more bright light in the early part of the day. That's the part that makes the most difference.
So I'm wondering about kids then. Do they develop this? Like if they are already kind of wired to be more sensitive to these signals, but then you mentioned earlier kind of it's common in the teen years, and we see that more teen college age students. So is it something that can be developed, and is that because the habits then reinforce what's happening with their circadian rhythms?
There's definitely a developmental biological change associated with adolescence. So there have been studies looking at young people living in societies that don't have electricity and have no electric lighting or devices. I think in Amazonian tribes and tribes living in Papua New Guinea, and the teenagers there still stay up an hour or two later than their parents, and still want to sleep in longer in the morning. And so it's certainly not entirely environmental. There really is a very real physiological age-related change, and one can only speculate why nature might want teenagers to stay up later than their parents. But it's magnified by any behaviours that might lead to more light exposure at night time, or less light exposure in the morning. So if an individual has a habit of using their phone, using their computer late at night before bed, and especially in bed, then that's going to delay sleep, and
Like,
that seems
check.
yeah, that's it is. And there was a study recently that found that the most detrimental habit is actually phone use in bed, and that's actually really common to use the phone during the night. So a reasonable number of teenagers, and without their parents being aware, are actually report checking their phone throughout the night. So they'll wake up, at 1 a.m., at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and check their phone for notifications, and maybe even send messages to people, in the middle of the night. And the light exposure that they get in the middle of the night is that's the time when our system is at its most sensitive. So the system is especially responsive in terms of the delaying effect to light exposure that we get right in the very middle of the night. So that's the key time to not be doing that. If you can have your if your teenagers can leave their phone out of their bedroom during night time, that would be a good habit.
Let me ask you then, how would a parent know if what's going on with their child is something like delayed phase sleep disorder or circadian rhythm disorder? Because also, as you're describing, we know that teenagers and adolescents, like their clock does tend to shift, which is why so many schools are for high school, they're having start times be later. So what is the threshold for this being something that would be considered a complex sleep issue versus kind of just a typical kind of late night teen?
It is somewhat subjective, it's somewhat ambiguous. So it really depends on whether it's causing impairment and causing distress. So it's a problem if it's a problem. Like for some people, they might follow a pattern where their sleep is very delayed and they are sleeping from 4 a.m. until midday, but they're actually okay with that. And they might be working in entertainment, they might be working in hospitality. Yeah, their job involves them staying up till midnight, and they don't have to start work till 4 p.m. and that's just fine. They have a very late running circadian rhythm. It's not maladaptive though, so we wouldn't call that a disorder. Whereas other people, their delay might be relatively small, and their circadian rhythm might have them sleeping between say 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. but they have to get up at 6 a.m. and so they're only getting 5 hours sleep. And that would then be a disorder because they're sleep deprived. Because 5 hours sleep, especially for a teenager, is nowhere near enough. I mean, it's not enough for an adult either. And so it's really relative to the individual's circumstances. And I think it tends to be relatively obvious when you talk to a family, you talk to the young person, and they tend to know. Most teenagers I've talked to tend to know that they have a sleep problem, and the families certainly know. I think the fact that it's common doesn't mean it's not a problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if it's only 2 hours out of what might be ideal, that can still be a really significant problem. I think a pretty large percentage of teenagers, especially in America, where school starts so early in so many places, are suffering from that. In New Zealand, schools start at 9 o'clock or so, and teenagers are often not, having to wake up until 8 o'clock. But from my understanding, in America, schools for high schoolers often start a lot earlier than that.
They could, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that can be quite a challenge, which makes it a problem.
Before we get into what to do if our kids are struggling with these sleep challenges, I have one more question. And this is something a member of my community asked me about, and it was also super relatable. And this idea that kids who do get, 9 hours of sleep, I'm using air quotes, like on paper, they're getting 9 hours of sleep, but they consistently verbalize, I didn't sleep well. I'm always tired. It doesn't matter how much sleep I get. Is that something separate? Might that be indicative of something like sleep apnea or some other type of sleep challenge?
Yeah. I would be starting to think about something's not right about the quality of the sleep. So the amount of the sleep is good. That's unlikely to be a circadian rhythm disorder or insomnia. But something about that quality isn't good. The most common sleep disorder affecting quality of sleep is a breathing related sleep disorder. Sleep apnea is a fairly common problem. It's more common in older adults, of course, but a reasonable number of young people as well have sleep apnea, and it's certainly more common in neurodivergent young people for reasons that seem hard to know for certain. Listened to actually a podcast recently talking about hypermobility and the connection between hypermobility and sleep apnea, and there's one pathway may be that the upper airway is actually more collapsible in people with hypermobility syndrome, and that overlap with autism especially may explain some of the sleep apnea. And so, yes, I guess if your child is sleepy despite getting enough sleep, one thing to be thinking about would be, are they snoring or showing other signs of poor breathing? You know, if you can sneak in and sort of closely observe your sleeping child's breathing. Is their breathing noisy? Especially, that's the key thing to think about. Does it seem to be irregular? Are there pauses?
Yeah.
Does it seem to be straining to breathe easily? You know, someone that age, a young person should be breathing very easily during sleep. It shouldn't be, and if it is an effort, then that's going to be lessening the depth of their sleep. You know, any airway resistance is going to lead to lighter sleep.
Okay, super interesting. And I'll just say that connection between hypermobility and sleep apnea is fascinating. I'm working to get someone on the show to talk about hypermobility. So now I know to also see if I can loop that in. So thank you for sharing that. But okay, so let's pivot back. That was a little bit of a detour. Let's pivot back to circadian rhythm challenges, differences, however we want to define that. So I guess the big question is, can they be treated? Can we help kids who struggle with this? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. The goal is to realign the circadian rhythm with their desired sleep schedule. Generally, that's something that you do gradually, and so you're trying to draw forward their internal body clock in incremental steps over a period of usually a couple of weeks, because it's somewhat kind of stubborn and only responds to small steps. Maybe 15 minutes a day. Something like that is a sort of a good approximation. And the key things that will drive that change are getting, as we talked about, getting more bright light exposure after the sleep phase. So after your young person wakes up, getting more bright light. Most research studies use 30 minutes of light over. They use a threshold of 10,000 lux of light. So lux is a unit of illumination at a surface. They sometimes use light boxes, which are like very, very bright boxes. I've actually got some in here I'm using to light my room. Things like this.
Yeah, I have one of those.
I do. Yeah. And you can get well over 10,000 lux by just going outside. So that's the best way to do it. Even an overcast day will be probably 20,000 or more lux. A bright day can be 100,000 lux. Or getting light visors. I do have some, but they're not in the room with me. There's a few different brands: the Luminettes, the AOs, ProPeaks. If you look online, there's various different options. I don't know which ones, to be honest, are better than others. They're a pretty straightforward mechanism, really. You're just trying to light up your eye socket. And those are quite good because you can wear them around your house while you're doing your morning routine, while you're having breakfast or getting ready. And we're actually doing that with my son. He puts them on first thing, actually. When I wake him up in the morning, first thing he does, he puts his light visors on, and that helps him to fall asleep more easily at night time. So you get the light exposure for at least half an hour of that sufficient brightness after waking. A key thing is you don't want to get that light too early. If your young person is waking quite late, currently, if they're waking at 11 a.m., or if that's when they naturally wake up, like on the weekend or on a day off, that's their biological wake time. You don't want to get the light exposure too early. If you get that light exposure before like 9 a.m., like say they have days where they're getting up for school or for work or something, and they're getting up at 8 a.m. If they get exposure to light that early, like 2 hours or more before their natural wake time, that light can actually backfire and further delay their body clock. So if you get light that's earlier than about 2 hours before the natural wake time, it will have the wrong effect, the opposite effect of what you want.
What do we know what a natural wake time is, though? Like, is it what
Yes.
they would sleep in on a weekend? Or what if they're just catching up from their exhaustion for the whole week? How do we figure that out?
Yeah, exactly. I guess the other way to think about it is that turnover time where light goes from delaying your body clock to pushing your body clock earlier is about 6 hours after you fall asleep in
Okay.
your sort of the time you naturally fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are having to estimate that. You can work it out physiologically, but it involves a very uncomfortable probe to measure your internal body temperature, or swallowing a very expensive pill to measure your internal body temperature. And so you estimate that time, but most people, it's not really. You don't need to get it exact because you want to get the bright light exposure well after that critical threshold time anyway. But it's key to be aware of that, because a lot of people, a big part of maintaining their problem is that they're actually forcing themselves up a few hours before their natural wake time quite regularly, and
Mm-hmm.
that may be the time they're getting their most light exposure. So they may be falling asleep at 3 a.m. They're getting up every day at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. even to go to school or go to work or university, and that's the only time they're outdoors is that brief commute. That's when they're
Mm-hmm.
getting bright light exposure. That's the exact worst possible time to be getting it, because that's when their system is at its most sensitive to the delaying effect of light.
Right.
And then the rest of the morning they're indoors and they're not getting any light exposure at the time that would help move their body clock earlier, which would be light sort of later in the morning. Even in the early afternoon, the light would be beneficial. And then that's kind of actually trapping them into this delayed phase position.
Right.
And so that's one thing to be aware of. So if your body clock is quite delayed like that and your natural wake time is late morning and you're forced to get up early in the morning because of your commitments, you may actually want to avoid light early in the morning
Mm-hmm.
and wear sunglasses, wear a hat. If you're indoors, keep the light levels low for the first part of the early morning as you're getting
Mm-hmm.
started on this strategy, and get the light exposure towards the late morning to start with, and then gradually move it earlier, just to complicate things for you there a little bit more.
I'm getting, yeah, to complicate, I'm getting a sense of, I mean, when you first said, yeah, so you're going to want to move this in 15-minute increments and slowly start to readjust. And, I was like, okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. But this actually does sound like it is a very complex process. And there are a lot of factors to
Yeah,
consider,
and
and why a parent would want to have the support of a professional to help navigate this,
yeah.
right?
Yes, and this is where I got seeing a sleep specialist, going to a sleep clinic, seeing a psychologist or a sleep doctor, someone who specialises in sleep medicine, can be helpful when it's complicated. I think you can't do much harm by trying this.
Yeah.
The worst that can happen is that your body clock moves a little bit earlier or a little bit later if you try it out at home, and there's a pretty good chance that you'll benefit things. But when it gets complicated, it certainly is helpful to see someone who specialises in this. Most psychologists probably won't have enough
Yeah.
training in this to understand the circadian rhythm complexities.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have some understanding, but perhaps not in the full detail.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be something that there's not a lot of information on. I mean, this is a topic I've been looking to cover on the show for a while, and I was so happy that I found you. And I read an article that you wrote, which listeners I'll share in the show notes. But it's not like it's super easy to find someone who really understands the nuances of this with kids, and especially with that neurodivergent affirming lens, because that also is going to complicate things, especially, with a lot of listeners who have kids who have a more, demand avoidant profile, for example. And
Yes.
so trying to get support or support a child in making these changes couldn't be even more complex with those kids, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a huge aspect of this is around motivation and kind of adhering to this plan, developing a routine, and obviously it only works when the youngster adheres to that schedule. And so getting the buy-in of your child and for me of the client is absolutely essential. Yeah, a big part of my, I guess the energy and is trying to connect with the client. So when I'm working with kids and teenagers, there's this combination of working with the parents and working directly with the young person. And a lot of what I'm thinking about is how to make this appealing to the young person and how to tie this in with things that matter to them, thinking about their, what do they care about and how might this help them with the things they care about, thinking about their sports or their energy for their hobbies, their social life. For some of them, it's about their schooling. What is it that they care about? Because imposing it as a regimented, top-down sort of set of rules, that certainly could easily backfire.
Yeah, and I imagine as kids get older, that buy-in is even more and more important. It has to matter to them in the first place. Even though I know, just want to acknowledge for parents who have kids who are navigating this, how challenging it can be. Because as a parent, you just constantly feel like you're trying to keep things on track and always having to be the one getting your kid up and doing all of those things. And of course, the child not being happy about that, and everyone's tired. And I know a lot of people get stuck in this kind of really painful cycle. I'm going to have to wrap up soon. And before I do that, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, would you be willing to come back in the future to answer some specific questions from folks? Because we just couldn't get into everything in this time period.
Yeah,
would you
of
do
course.
that? Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very happy.
I mean, I think this is there's so much more that we could explore together. But let me ask a question about melatonin, because that is something that so many families, use. We used it from, when my child was very young because of that inability to just shut down at night and actually fall asleep. And so what are your thoughts on melatonin specifically for these kinds of complex sleep issues?
I guess there's a lot of sort of uncertainty about melatonin. Like it's not as well researched as we'd like, or as I'd like, I suppose. And its safety profile I think is not as well understood as I'd like it to be. But we don't, at the same time, it doesn't look like there's any known danger to using it that's sort of that I've come across either. And for a lot of neurodivergent kids, it seems to be very helpful. And my son takes a low dose of melatonin for his sleep, and continues and finds that really beneficial. So I'm quite happy using it for him. There's research specifically for delayed sleep phase syndrome in using melatonin specifically to move the body clock earlier as well. But it's used in a slightly different way to how it might be used for a sort of a more straightforward insomnia. In the research studies using it for advancing the body clock, people take a very low dose and they take it a lot earlier. So the general recommendation is taking, I believe it's 0.2 milligrams, so a very small dose, 5 to 7 hours before the current average sleep onset. And so if the child is falling asleep at 1 a.m., then they would be taking it in the late afternoon, early evening, and it would involve some kind of fragmentation of a tablet to get the low dose. Obviously, you'd want to talk to your prescriber about this to make sure that your child's general practitioner or pediatrician is on board when dealing with medications. In my country, at least until recently, melatonin was a prescription medication. It's now over the counter.
Is it? Okay. Interesting.
But I certainly recommend that. And it seems that the melatonin sends a signal to the body clock in the brain that it's nighttime, that it needs to start getting itself ready for sleep. And it doesn't, at that dose, have a sedating effect. So when people take it for bringing their body clock earlier, they take this tiny dose of melatonin in the evening. They don't feel sleepy, but it seems to draw forward the timing at which their body clock does generate sleep.
Okay.
So as you're bringing forward the body clock, you actually bring forward the timing of the melatonin as well. So you're always taking it 5 to 7 hours before sleep onset. So that's another sort of a way of using that.
Hmm.
And interestingly, there's studies on how much melatonin does the brain naturally produce during the night suggests that the natural amount would be about 0.3 milligrams a night.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people are taking, 3 milligrams in a tablet, which would already be 10 times the amount the brain naturally produces. Some people are taking 10 milligrams, which would be more than 30 times the natural quantity,
wow.
which is pretty incredible. And so I'm a proponent of low dose melatonin, and there's also studies comparing the efficacy of different doses and finding that higher doses are no more effective than lower doses anyway. It seems to be not really dose responsive like most other medications. It seems to be more like an on-off type effect. And just having it there has an effect, but having more of it doesn't seem to have better effect.
I'm going to ask you 2 more questions and then we are really going to wrap up. So one question is just if we're kind of zooming out, I said, are there ways that we can get kids back on track? And this is something that you can get back on a regular schedule with the right motivation and the right intervention. So I just want to kind of leave listeners with a little bit of hope if this is something that they're navigating, that if your child has a non-24s, has had this delayed sleep phase challenges for a while now, it is possible with the right support to get onto a better schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The body clock will respond to these environmental effects. I think the consistency is the key thing. So it is about how consistently are these effects applied, and that's where the challenge lies. But it really can come together. And I think it is also worth thinking about the developmental benefits that come with maturity as well. And so it's also worth remembering that it's for most people it is a phase that improves with age. And so as your youngster gets older, their body clock generally moves earlier.
I always say that time is on our side, in that our kids are going to continue to grow and mature in age and develop, and things will start to come together. And as we know with neurodivergent kids, that process can sometimes take longer than with neurotypical kids.
So it's really about routine. Routine is such a big thing with sleep. And quite a number of my clients, they like routine, and they ultimately can get on board with routine around sleep. And they kind of like the gadgets. So they kind of have liked light exposure, the light visors. In the morning, if your clients where that's kind of appealed to them, and a matching gadget that you can wear at night are orange tinted glasses, which block blue light at night time, which suppresses melatonin. And so if you can combine light visors in the morning with orange glasses at night, for some kids that can be appealing. Certainly not for all. Not for all, but
Well, I'll include links, to some of those things in the show notes to listeners if you want to get a sense of, not that you should buy this particular light box or light visor, but just so you can check it out and see what it's like. And if that's something you want to explore, I'm going to look into the light visor. We do have a light box here and my kid has one at university, more for seasonal affective, disorder during the dark winters. But it's good to know that they can be used this way as well. Do you have any other resources or favorite websites or organizations or books, anything that listeners navigating this could check out?
I think there's one book that I think I found most helpful. It's a little older now. It's called Reset Your Inner Clock. Michael Terman, who was kind of a pioneer in the field of what came to be called chronotherapy. That really spells out in very practical terms how to go about this type of therapy, and it's written very much as a sort of a self-help book in a way. Very very practical. It emphasizes using light boxes, and I think sort of wherever it talks about using light boxes, you can think about just going outside or using a light visor. So it's a little dated because it was pre-LED technology. But that's probably the best single book that I've encountered. I've no doubt that there will be YouTube videos and probably TikTok videos now that explore this, but I don't have I don't have any specific ones that I'd recommend. I really should look some up. As I mentioned, I wrote a short article for Attitude that could be worth reading.
Yes, it is worth reading. I'll definitely share it, listeners. I encourage you to check that out. And I'll share a link to this book as well. I came to this conversation with 3 pages of questions, and I think probably this conversation I'll hear from a lot of folks too, because I think we are just kind of scratching the surface. So first of all, I want to say thank you for getting up. Well, you explained that you are a morning person, so this isn't first thing for you, but I appreciate you spending time with us this morning and talking us through all of this and explaining it in such detail. And yes, I would love if you want to come back down the road and we'll dive into it a little deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for inviting me on.
Yes, thank you.
To come back. That's helpful.
Sounds wonderful. All right, thanks, Alex, and enjoy the rest of your day.
No problem. No problem. All the best.